Russia is still able to wage its war. Russian rockets with Western components are still falling on Ukraine. Most Western products and luxury goods are still available in Russia. So are the sanctions working? How did Russia prepare for them, and has it learned how to evade them? And have we in the West helped them with this? Before we discuss this, we need to ask an important question. Are the sanctions working at all?
Economists are certain that the West's sanctions against Russia are working. They've hit Russia hard, especially alongside the growing costs of the war. The situation in Russia is getting much worse. Putin is still able to finance this war, but the challenges facing the Kremlin are mounting.
Still, the Russian economy has not collapsed and is holding on better than many expected. And we know why. Firstly, we need to be aware that Western countries only made up half of Russia's trade.
This means that half the export and import from before the war was with countries which didn't join the sanctions regime. Most of these countries are helping Russia to break the sanctions. Of course, for financial reasons, they're also trying to exploit Russia's difficult situation.
But the sanctions are nevertheless still evaded, as we are discussing in this film. When war broke out, the West tried to cut Russia off from Western products. The Kremlin worried that people would react to the absence of these goods, and so it took steps to prevent any discontent. What did this look like? Firstly, these goods would be brought by ordinary people and small businesses. The government did this to allow more products to be brought to Russia without facing customs. In practice, everyone who traveled to Russia could bring quite a lot of Western products into the country, and many people chose to do this.
This meant a return to the 1990s. Those first months saw problems with imports. Western logistics firms did not want to deliver goods to Russia. Western producers were also worried about reputational damage. And the loss of these imports was replaced by activity from Russian small businesses and Russian citizens. It was a return to the 90s, so carrying goods in bags and meeting Russian demand for these products, which had disappeared from the shelves with this suitcase trade.
Another method used is parallel import. This means that products are imported without consent from the brand owner. Russia's Ministry of Economic Development compiled a detailed list of sanctioned goods, such as smartphones, computers, cars, microchips. The items on this list could be brought into Russia via third countries, usually neighboring countries. The success of this strategy is seen in this graph. These data show the huge falls in exports of Western goods to Russia. At the same time, though, we can see an increase in Western exports to countries bordering Russia.
This, of course, arouses suspicion that these goods are simply still going to Russia, just via these third countries. So Russian companies used this method. On the one hand, this was sometimes down to ignorance on the behalf of these European corporations who chose to export to third countries. Insufficient checks on their partners in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, or Turkey. Do they really need so much of these products? But sometimes they just wanted to make money because they of course profited from this procedure, both the European companies and also of course all the intermediaries who took these goods to Russia.
This procedure didn't just involve normal items like smartphones. The real problem comes in when it concerns dual-use technology, which can also be applied when producing weapons.
We know this, for example, from Ukrainian intelligence reports. They inspect the rockets, the military equipment that falls on their territory. And there are still Western components in this equipment. This is a scandalous situation when you think that these exact products are on a short list of products which all the countries of the G7 plus Australia have pledged to respect, and to not allow deliveries to Russia, including via third countries.
This is a tapered roller bearing. It has an unassuming name and is used in many different machines, for example in the rail and automobile industries. And they can be used in arms production, including tanks. So this is a classic example of a dual-use item, which is why this product was sanctioned in April 2022. And if we look at exports of these bearings from the EU to Russia, we see that when sanctions were introduced, they fall to practically zero. However, at the same time, EU exports see a sharp increase to Kazakhstan and Turkey.
Pod koniec 2022 roku eksport do Turcji osiągnął...
At the end of 2022, exports to Turkey reached a stable level. This correlates to when European exports to Russia hit zero. In the case of Kazakhstan, this European export only rose after sanctions were introduced, meaning in 2023. It went from zero to a significant level, and they are still holding up, although not as high as they were. In 2024, European exports fell quite significantly in Kazakhstan, and also fell a little in Turkey. The UN database allows us to track where the exports from those countries went, and we can see that both Turkish and Kazakh exports of these bearings to Russia is almost on the same scale. The scale of this phenomenon is very similar. In the case of Kazakhstan, it's perhaps a bit more suspicious because there were no European exports there before the Russian invasion. So this may suggest that most likely they are just passing through Kazakhstan en route to Russia. With Turkey, there were exports, so the phenomenon could potentially be much more complicated. Nevertheless, regardless of the scale of complexity, we do see a rise in European exports and an increase of exports to Russia from these intermediary countries. But we must remember that imports of dual-use items to Russia have fallen sharply. It's visible on this graph. Nevertheless, the example of tapered roller bearings shows that the sanctions have loopholes, and evading them is like a game of whack-a-mole. This example of bearings is also good because we can see the change in export channels in various ways, as evading sanctions is potentially complicated. With Turkey, European exports are relatively stable there, but later we observe changes in the channels along which Turkey is still exporting, and we can suspect that it's still going to Russia. With Kazakhstan, though, we don't currently have the data about where it's going when it leaves Kazakhstan, but we see changes in the European export channels, which means that when one country stops exporting to Kazakhstan, another one starts, and it changes like that. So monitoring sanctions in this way is a little like playing whack-a-mole. There are obviously many more ways to evade sanctions in the financial sector. Cryptocurrency transactions with gold and with third-country intermediaries were also helpful for Russia. But there are also more straightforward methods, such as changing a product's customs code.
Let's remember that the sanctions imposed by the West are not for whole product groups. That's rare. For example, with wood. But in many cases, these are specific, usually 6-digit custom codes. These goods have sanctions on them, but Russian businesses, with help from their European partners, have tried changing their code to one which isn't on the European sanctions list, mainly the European ones, because with America it's much harder.
Another way is by exploiting transit. It's still possible to transport goods to third countries through Russian territory. This has seen the countries of Central Asia importing certain categories of goods from Europe en masse. The only route for these goods is through Russia, but instead of traveling on their way to the final recipient, for example in Kyrgyzstan, they remain in Russia. This procedure has also obviously been detected. The reaction of the Central Asian countries was simply to stop publishing customs data. One entirely different story concerns how Russia evades sanctions on energy. First of all, we need to stress that the oil and gas industry makes up as much as 30 to 50% of Russia's entire budget revenue. So this money is crucial for the Russian war machine. First, we'll focus on oil. According to the sanctions, Russian oil cannot be sold for more than $60 a barrel. This is the so-called price cap. Russia has tried to avoid this by using a shadow fleet. These tankers are owned or at least registered in Gabon or other countries where often there are simply no links to the Western markets. This means that Russian exports can still take place, and so Russia can continue to sell its oil, and its treasury is still receiving real revenue from hard currencies from foreign clients. All this means that Russia's war machine can keep going. A large part of this shadow fleet is old tankers belonging to Western firms. Russia got ready for the sanctions by buying up these old Western vessels. The majority of the EU countries wanted to stop this. But 3 countries did not agree to the ban on reselling tankers for the Russian shadow fleet: Malta, Cyprus, and Greece. Oil sanctions therefore are still a problem of execution. Western companies can still sell Russian oil, but it must be cheaper than $60 a barrel. The problem here is that the market price is sometimes higher. This rouses suspicion that Western companies are falsifying their data to reduce the cost of oil.
W globalnych rynkach cena jest dużo powyżej $60.
In reality, if the global market price is much higher than $60 a barrel, then we can be sure that most of the oil is being sold above the price cap, and most likely those Western businesses are falsifying their transaction papers and are thus participants in sanctions evasion. The European Union has still not introduced any sanctions on Russian gas. More films on the de-Russification of the EU's energy sector and the remaining EU-Russia links will be appearing on our channel soon. For now, we need to ask one question. What happens next with the sanctions? So far, the main driving force for the sanctions has been the US administration, but the next steps of American policy are now unclear.
Co oznacza, że to Europa.
This means that Europe, which has so far been hiding behind America's activity, should take on this responsibility and increase the pressure on the Russian economy. We aren't seeing this political will, which leads to pessimism.
But there are also reasons to be optimistic. Russian provocation means that Europe is beginning to notice the problem of the shadow fleet.
There are inspections conducted on these tankers by Estonia, by Finland, and let's hope that soon other countries will join in and the activity of the shadow fleet can be truly limited, above all on the Baltic Sea.
We started this film by saying that Ukraine is still sometimes attacked by weapons with Western components. This is because of the ineffective sanctions on dual-use items. How can Europe fight this? The most effective tool is secondary sanctions, which have been used by America. This means countries which help Russia evade sanctions can be punished. The EU should now introduce secondary sanctions.
In many cases, there's no need to apply secondary sanctions. The threat of them alone is enough to scare off companies from third countries.
As we said at the start, the sanctions are in large part working, and they cause many problems for Russia and its war machine. We've shown how the sanctions are evaded and where the loopholes are. The conclusion is that Europe's most important role is to monitor the sanctions which are already in place.
There's huge room for maneuver here and lots of work for the EU member states, because it's not the European Commission, but the member states which are responsible for ensuring the sanctions are respected. And each country still has a lot of work to do to truly introduce those sanctions to the level intended when they were adopted.
Accompanying this film is a new webpage on sanctions. You can find the link in the description.